mind, a lethal bond of silver and silk. In a world of cold masks and high stakes, the most dangerous gamble isn't the mission. It's the truth hidden behind the wall. We are about to hear this story right now. The air inside the magically expanded carriage was suffocatingly thin, heavy with the scent of ozone, impending rain, and the infuriatingly crisp, expensive notes of bergamot that always seemed to cling to Draco Malfoy. Hermione Granger kept her eyes fixed firmly on the plush velvet upholstery of the seat opposite her. Her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were entirely white. The rhythmic, echoing clatter of the Thestral's hooves against the smooth cobblestones of magical Monaco felt like a relentless countdown, each strike perfectly matching the frantic, uneven beating of her own heart. This was madness. The Ministry's plan was utter, unforgivable madness, and she was a fool for ever agreeing to it. "Stop doing that," a voice drawled from the shadows to her left. The sound was smooth, cold, and entirely devoid of the sheer, blinding panic currently clawing its way up her throat. Hermione's head snapped toward him, her curls shifting heavily against her bare shoulders. "Doing what, exactly?" she snapped back, her voice tight and defensive. She despised the way he looked sitting there, draped in the darkness of the carriage. He wore a set of impeccably tailored black dress robes that looked as though they had been spun from the night sky itself, the sharp cut highlighting the aristocratic, unforgiving lines of his shoulders. He looked entirely in his element, a sleek, dangerous predator returning to its natural, gilded hunting ground. "You are vibrating, Granger," Draco said, leaning forward slowly. The dim, flickering light from the enchanted carriage lanterns caught the silver blonde of his hair and the pale, sharp angle of his jaw. "If you enter Lamasque door radiating that much terrified Gryffindor righteousness, the security detail will spot us before we even reach the Bakarat tables. We are supposed to be deeply, obscenely in love. Try to look at me as if I am the absolute center of your universe, not a particularly disgusting flobberworm you found on the bottom of your shoe." Hermione let out a harsh, breathless laugh that held absolutely no humor. "It would be significantly easier to pretend I was in love with a flobberworm, Malfoy. A flobberworm wouldn't have spent 6 years making my life a living hell, and a flobberworm wouldn't currently be condescending to me when we are about to walk into a den of violent criminals." The moment the bitter words left her mouth, the temperature in the small enclosed space seemed to plummet to freezing. The emotional seesaw tipped violently, throwing them entirely off balance. The fragile, highly professional truce they had barely managed to maintain during their weeks of ministry briefings shattered into 1,000 pieces, replaced instantly by the bitter, cold reality of their history. Draco's grey eyes darkened from the colour of rain to the colour of iron. The casual, aristocratic arrogance bled entirely out of his expression, leaving behind something utterly unreadable and dangerously sharp. He didn't argue. He didn't offer a biting, cruel retort to put her back in her place. Instead, he moved. In one fluid, terrifyingly swift motion, he crossed the small space separating them, his large frame crowding her against the side of the carriage. Hermione gasped, pressing herself back deep into the velvet cushions as his hands reached out for her. Panic, sharp, blinding and entirely instinctual, flared hot in her chest. But his hands didn't go to her throat, nor did he reach for his wand. They went instead to the sensitive nape of her neck. "Turn around," he commanded softly. His voice was barely more than a rough whisper, yet it demanded absolute, unquestioning obedience. "Your necklace is twisted. The clasp is caught in your hair." Hermione froze, her breath hitching in her chest. The sheer physical proximity of him was entirely overwhelming. She could feel the distinct heat radiating from his chest through his fine robes. She could clearly see the tiny, faint white scar cutting delicately through the left side of his eyebrow. The conflict warring within her screamed at her to push him away, to draw her wand and curse him for daring to touch her so casually, so intimately. But the mission, the hidden ledger containing the names of every prominent smuggler currently feeding dark artifacts to the remnants of the Death Eaters, depended entirely on this exact facade. She forced her body to go slack, turning her head slowly, exposing the highly vulnerable, pale line of her throat to him. His long, pale fingers brushed against her bare skin. The touch was incredibly light, almost painfully gentle, and completely at odds with the brutal coldness that had been in his eyes merely seconds before. Hermione shuddered involuntarily, a tiny gasp escaping her parted lips. It was a terrifying, mind-bending paradox. Here was the boy who had coldly watched her bleed on his aunt's drawing-room floor, now carefully and methodically unspooling a twisted chain of heavy, charmed diamonds against her collarbone. The unexpected warmth of his knuckles grazing her sensitive skin sent a massive jolt of electricity straight down her spine, a spark of pure, unadulterated physical awareness that made her feel instantly, violently sick with guilt. "Breathe, Granger," he murmured, his breath ghosting warmly over the shell of her ear and sending a fresh shiver cascading down her arms. "You are stiff as a board. You are supposed to be Lyra Vance, the notoriously demanding heiress to a French magical fortune, and my devastatingly beautiful, entirely untouchable mistress. Act like it." He snapped the delicate silver clasp into place with a soft, final click. For a fraction of a second longer than was necessary, his thumbs lingered heavily on the tops of her bare shoulders, applying a gentle, strangely grounding pressure. It was a moment of shocking, unexpected warmth, a sudden emotional anchor thrown to her in the middle of a raging, terrifying storm. In that fleeting second, Hermione felt a sudden, inexplicable surge of genuine trust, a desperate, incredibly foolish hope that maybe, just maybe, they could actually pull this impossible heist off without completely destroying each other in the process. Then, the carriage lurched violently to a halt. Instantly, Draco pulled his hands away, the comforting warmth vanishing from her skin as if it had never existed at all. The heavy, impenetrable mask of the arrogant, untouchable Malfoy heir slammed firmly back into place on his features. "Showtime," he muttered darkly, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt without sparing her a single glance. The carriage doors swung open on well-oiled hinges, revealing the blinding, gilded, magical entrance of Lamasque door. The sheer volume of noise hit them like a physical blow. The delicate clinking of crystal champagne flutes, the soft, seductive, rhythmic hum of an enchanted jazz band playing in the corner, and the low, dangerous murmur of the wealthiest, most corrupt witches and wizards in all of Europe. Draco stepped out onto the lush red carpet first, turning smoothly and offering his hand to her. Hermione stared at his open palm for a long, agonizing second. This was the precipice. There was no going back once she took it. Taking a deep, fortifying breath, she placed her gloved hand delicately in his. The absolute moment her fingers wrapped around his grip tightened significantly. It wasn't a punishing grip, but a deeply possessive one. He pulled her with practiced ease, bringing her flush against his side, his arm wrapping securely and firmly around her waist. As they walked gracefully up the grand marble steps together, Hermione forced her rigid posture to relax completely, leaning her weight intentionally into his side, tilting her head intimately toward his shoulder. To anyone watching from the bustling casino floor, they were the absolute perfect picture of toxic, obsessive, pure-blood devotion. Draco bent his head low, his lips hovering mere millimeters from her temple, so close she could feel the vibration of his words. "Target acquired," he whispered, the deep rumble of his voice traveling straight from his chest directly into hers. 3 o'clock. Balcony overlooking the high-stakes roulette tables. Do not look directly at him yet. Let him notice us first. Hermione's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but she kept a serene, slightly bored, highly arrogant smile painted perfectly on her face. She allowed her gaze to sweep lazily over the opulent room, letting it briefly, carelessly snag on the large, imposing figure of Antonin Dolohof's ruthless nephew, the current, heavily guarded holder of the smuggling ledger. He was surrounded by a thick phalanx of heavily armed security, his dark, suspicious eyes scanning the wealthy crowd with a paranoid, predatory intensity. Draco's large hand slid just a fraction lower on her waist, pulling her impossibly closer against him as they navigated the throng of elegantly dressed patrons. Every single point of contact between their moving bodies felt like a live, sparking wire. The sheer, overwhelming physical intimacy of the lie was suffocating her. She was supposed to trust this man with her actual life tonight, to completely surrender her highly guarded mental shields to him later, when they played the tables so he could cheat via legilimency. Yet, as he expertly guided her toward the private golden lifts that led to their complimentary high roller suite, all she could focus on was how easily, how flawlessly he had slipped into the role of her devoted lover, and how utterly terrifying it was that she was already beginning to find a sick, twisted comfort in his touch. The heavy, enchanted lift doors slid shut with a soft chime, instantly cutting off the chaotic, overwhelming noise of the casino floor. The heavy silence that followed inside the small ascending box was absolutely deafening. The very second the magical locks clicked, confirming they were entirely alone, the romantic illusion shattered completely. Draco dropped his arm from her waist with violent speed, reacting as if she had suddenly caught fire. He stepped back quickly, retreating to the absolute furthest corner of the lift. The physical distance between them was immediate, harsh, and incredibly jarring. Hermione actually stumbled slightly, her body momentarily unmoored by the sudden, unexpected loss of his solid physical support. She looked up at him, her chest heaving slightly under the heavy silk of her gown. The brutal, unforgiving coldness was back in his grey eyes, a towering, defensive wall of ice that made her stomach twist violently with a strange, highly confusing pang of loss. "Well," Draco said, his voice clipped, hollow and dripping with disdain as the lift shot upward. That wasn't entirely disastrous for a first attempt. Let us just hope to Salazar that your mental shields are significantly stronger than your acting skills, Granger, or we are both going to end up chained to the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea before sunrise. Hermione firmly crossed her arms over her chest, discreetly rubbing the spot on her waist where his warm hand had been resting just moments before, desperately trying to erase the lingering phantom heat of his touch. The terrifying approach, the brief, confusing warmth, the sudden, violent repulsion, it was exactly the emotional whiplash she had feared most about this assignment. The true, deadly danger of this undercover mission wasn't the violent smuggler upstairs, nor was it his army of guards. It was the horrifying realization that she had absolutely no idea which version of Draco Malfoy was the lie, and which was the reality. And the most terrifying part of all, as the lift approached their floor, was that she desperately, hungrily needed to know exactly what was coming next. The heavy, enchanted lift doors slid open with a muted musical chime, revealing the sprawling, agonizingly opulent penthouse suite of Lamasque door. Hermione stepped out of the confined space of the elevator, her heels sinking silently into the plush, cream-colored carpeting. She stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat as she took in the space designed exclusively for their fabricated, obscenely wealthy alter egos. The suite was a masterpiece of ostentatious, sickeningly romantic excess. Vaulted ceilings were painted with moving constellations that mirrored the night sky above Monaco, casting a soft, starlit glow over the sunken living area. But it was the bedroom, visible through wide, arched double doors, that made Hermione's stomach plummet to the floor. A massive, antique four-poster bed dominated the room, draped in layers of sheer crimson silk that seemed to whisper and writhe in the ambient magical draught. Beside it, a silver bucket held a bottle of violently expensive goblin-wrought champagne, nestled in magically unmelting ice. It was a suffocatingly intimate stage set for a performance she was entirely unprepared to give. Draco strode past her, his long legs eating up the distance as he moved with the restless, predatory energy of a caged Kneazle. The aristocratic facade he had worn downstairs dissolved the moment the heavy oak door clicked shut behind them, sealing the wards. He shrugged off his impeccably tailored black dress jacket, tossing it carelessly onto a velvet chaise lounge before turning to face her. Without the structured coat, he looked deceptively less imposing, yet infinitely more dangerous. The crisp white lines of his dress shirt clung securely to his shoulders, the top two buttons undone, revealing a pale, sharp sliver of his collarbone. "Don't stare at the bed, Granger," Draco drawled, his voice a harsh, abrasive scrape against the velvet-draped silence of the room. The coldness was back, a freezing, impenetrable armor shielding whatever he had felt in the carriage. "We are not here to enjoy the amenities. We have exactly 20 minutes before Dolohof's nephew takes his seat at the high-stakes Bakarat table. We need to establish the psychic link right now, and you are currently projecting a mental fortress so thick I could crack my skull against it." Hermione tore her gaze away from the bedroom, her spine snapping painfully straight. The conflict they had to resolve before they could even attempt the heist was the most terrifying part of the Ministry's plan. To cheat the smuggler, Draco needed to use Legilimency to read the opponent's cards, and seamlessly feed that information directly into Hermione's mind while she played the distracting, beautiful heiress. But to do that, she had to lower every single one of her meticulously constructed occlumency shields. She had to let Draco Malfoy, the boy who had mocked her, the man who had witnessed her torture, walk completely unhindered into the deepest, most vulnerable recesses of her mind. "It is not a switch I can simply flip, Malfoy," Hermione snapped, her voice trembling with a mixture of profound exhaustion and rising panic. She crossed her arms tightly, a futile physical barrier against an invisible threat. "My shields are instinctual. They are trauma responses. Asking me to just drop them for you goes against every single survival instinct I possess." Draco stopped pacing. The heavy, volatile air in the suite seemed to thicken, pressing down on Hermione's lungs. He stared at her, his striking silver-grey eyes narrowing as he registered the genuine, unadulterated fear lacing her defiant words. The emotional seesaw tipped violently once again, pulling them away from the bitter, biting hostility and plunging them into a heavy, suffocatingly tense silence. He didn't mock her trauma. He didn't roll his eyes at her hesitation. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step toward her. Then another. "If you cannot let me in, Granger, the mission is already over," Draco stated quietly, the biting sarcasm entirely gone from his tone. He stopped merely a foot away from her, the scent of bergamot and static magic wrapped tightly around her, incredibly grounding and overwhelmingly terrifying all at once. Dolohof's nephew uses passive legilimency at the tables. If he senses even a fraction of your mental shielding, he will know you are hiding something. You have to be completely, utterly blank. You have to let me be the wall between your thoughts and his. "I know the theory," she whispered, her eyes fixed stubbornly on the silver knot of his silk tie. Her heart was hammering a frantic, bird-like rhythm against her ribs. Knowing it and allowing it are two vastly different things. "Look at me." The command was soft, but carried the undeniable weight of absolute authority. Hermione squeezed her eyes shut for a fleeting second, fighting the intense urge to turn and run out the heavy oak doors. Slowly, painfully, she tilted her chin up, meeting his gaze. His eyes were not cold now. They were an intense, molten silver, burning with a fierce, demanding focus. "I am going to enter your mind, Granger," Draco murmured, his voice dropping an octave, slipping right beneath her skin. He slowly raised his hand, hesitating for a fraction of a second before pressing his fingertips lightly against her temples. His touch was shockingly warm, sending a violent electrical jolt straight down her spine. "I am not looking for your secrets. I do not care about your fears or your Gryffindor regrets. I am merely building a bridge. Focus on my voice. Drop the bricks. Let the wall fall." Hermione gasped as the first probing touch of his magic brushed against the outer edges of her consciousness. It felt entirely different from the violent, tearing intrusion she had expected. It was a dark, smooth ribbon of silver magic, cool and precise, wrapping gently around the iron gates of her mental defenses. The sheer, terrifying intimacy of his presence inside her head made her physically sway. Instinctively, her mind violently threw up a secondary wall, a harsh barrier of blinding white light meant to expel the intruder. Draco flinched, his fingers tightening painfully against her temples. "Stop fighting me, Hermione," he grunted, the sudden, unexpected use of her first name hitting her harder than a physical blow. The absolute vulnerability in his own voice, the strain of trying to be gentle when his magic was inherently sharp, completely shattered her resolve. The trust he was demanding wasn't just for the mission. It was a demand that she see him as he was now, not the boy from their past. She took a ragged, shuddering breath, consciously unclenching her fists. Trust him, a tiny, insane voice whispered in the dark corners of her mind. You have to trust him. Slowly, agonizingly, she began to dismantle the fortress. She let the heavy iron gates of her occlumency rust and crumble. She imagined the towering stone walls of her mind dissolving into dust. As the last barrier fell away, Draco's presence flooded in completely. It was a profound, overwhelming rush of sensation. She could feel the sharp, calculating edges of his intellect, the heavy, suffocating weight of his own guarded anxiety, and beneath it all, a blazing, terrifyingly intense core of protectiveness that was entirely directed at her. But as his mind settled seamlessly into hers, the magical connection acted like a mirror. For one disastrous fraction of a second, a rogue, unguarded thought slipped from Hermione's consciousness directly into his. It was a fleeting, visceral memory from mere minutes ago in the carriage. The phantom, burning sensation of his thumbs resting bare against her shoulders, accompanied by a sharp, undeniable spike of pure, heated physical desire. Draco's eyes widened a fraction of an inch. His breath hitched audibly in the quiet room. The mental connection flared blindingly bright, white-hot and chaotic as he instantly registered her hidden, shameful attraction. The repulsion was immediate and violent. Draco yanked his hands away from her temples as if he had been physically burned, severing the deep mental link with a brutal, sickening snap that left Hermione dizzy and gasping for air. He staggered backward, his chest heaving, his face an unreadable mask of shock, horror, and something dangerously close to raw hunger. He spun away from her, raking a trembling hand through his perfectly styled blonde hair, putting the width of the velvet sofa between them. "Right," Draco choked out, his voice unnaturally thin and tight, completely devoid of its usual smooth arrogance. He stared fixedly at the crimson curtains, refusing to look anywhere near her flushed, humiliated face. "The link is established. The pathway is clear. You just keep the walls down, Granger. I will handle the rest." Hermione wrapped her arms around her own waist, her skin burning with an embarrassment so profound it made her eyes water. The conflict of establishing the psychic link was technically resolved. They had the connection they needed to cheat the smuggler. But the emotional fallout of that required vulnerability had completely devastated the fragile, professional ground they had been standing on. She had let him in, and in doing so, she had accidentally handed him the most dangerous weapon of all, the knowledge that she wanted him. Draco snatched his black jacket off the chaise, pulling it on with jerky, aggressive movements. The cold, impenetrable Malfoy air slammed back into existence, though the rigid tension in his shoulders betrayed the lie. He walked sharply to the heavy oak doors, pulling them open to reveal the dimly lit, golden corridor, waiting to take them back to the casino floor. He didn't look back at her. He merely held out his arm, a silent, demanding command to resume the performance. Hermione walked slowly toward him, her heart pounding a terrifying, erratic rhythm again at her ribs. As she slipped her trembling hand through the crook of his arm, she felt the rigid, unyielding tension in his muscles. He pulled her flush against his side, his large hand wrapping possessively around her waist once more, right where her skin still burned from his previous touch. The physical approach was exactly the same as before, but the context had irrevocably shifted. The air between them was practically humming with an unbearable, unspoken tension. They were walking straight into a den of murderers to steal a dark artifact. But as the golden lift arrived to take them down to the gambling floor, the only thing Hermione desperately, agonizingly needed to know was what Draco Malfoy was going to do with the secret he had just stolen from her mind. The descent back into the belly of Lamasque door was an exercise in pure, agonizing psychological torture. The physical reality of Draco's hand, resting heavily on the curve of Hermione's waist, was nothing compared to the phantom weight of his consciousness, hovering just at the edge of hers. The Legilimency link they had forged upstairs was a dormant, thrumming wire connecting their minds. She could feel his intense focus, a sharp, icy presence pressing against the battered remnants of her occlumency shields, waiting for the exact moment he would need to plunge completely back in. The external conflict was crystal clear. They had to take a seat at the high-stakes Bakarat table, engage Yuri Dolohov, and systematically bankrupt him to force a desperate wager where he would offer his vault key as collateral. But the internal conflict, the terrifying, unresolved exposure of her deep, hidden attraction to him, was a deafening roar in her ears that threatened to derail the entire operation before they even reached the floor. As they approached the velvet-roped VIP section, the air grew noticeably colder, thick with the dark, oppressive magic of the dangerous men seated around the semicircular table. Yuri Dolohov sat dead center, a mountain of a man with his uncle's cruel, heavy-lidded eyes and a massive jawline that looked as though it had been carved from brutalist concrete. He was surrounded by towering stacks of wizarding currency and dark, glittering, illegal gemstones. "Ah, Monsieur Malfoy," Dolohov rumbled, his thick, coarse accent scraping aggressively against the elegant jazz playing in the background. His dark, predatory gaze immediately slid from Draco and locked onto Hermione, dragging slowly over the crimson silk of her gown with a repulsive, wet hunger. "And the infamous Mademoiselle Vance. I was beginning to think the rumors of your unparalleled beauty were exaggerated. I see they were merely insufficient." The emotional seesaw jerked violently. Hermione felt a sudden, visceral spike of absolute repulsion toward Dolohov, her survival instinct screaming at her to draw her wand and hex the vile, degrading smirk right off his face. But before the panic could fully materialize and ruin her cover, a sudden, shocking wave of absolute, freezing calm washed completely over her mind. It wasn't her own. It was Draco. Through the psychic tether, he flooded her consciousness with a dark, soothing, almost narcotic tranquility, completely burying her rising terror beneath a heavy blanket of pure, focused ice. It was an act of profound, unexpected mental warmth, a fiercely protective shield thrown over her panicked, racing thoughts. Yet, physically, he remained utterly rigid, his face an arrogant, deeply bored mask of pure-blood superiority. "Keep your eyes on the cards, Dolohov," Draco drawled lazily, pulling out a velvet-upholstered chair for Hermione with practiced, flawless courtesy. My patience for your crude sycophancy is remarkably thin tonight, and Lyra finds your staring tedious. Hermione sank into the chair, crossing her long legs and resting her chin elegantly on her hand, playing the role of the bored, untouchable heiress to perfection. The dealer, a pale, scarred goblin with sharp, calculating eyes, began to seamlessly distribute the enchanted cards. The game of magical Bakarat was notoriously fast and entirely lethal. The cards were charmed to shift their numerical values based on the emotional volatility of the players holding them. To win, one had to possess absolute sociopathic control over their own heart rate and mind. "Let me in." Draco's voice echoed suddenly within the cavernous space of her mind, a dark, velvet whisper that made her physical body shiver involuntarily. "Drop the final wall, Hermione. He is probing." She didn't hesitate. The absolute trust required was terrifying, but necessary. She completely released her desperate grip on her own consciousness, allowing her mind to go utterly, dangerously blank. The very second she did, she felt the greasy, invasive scrape of Dolohof's passive Legilimency scratching viciously at the outer doors of her mind, trying to sense her strategy, her fear, her physical tells. But Dolohof found absolutely nothing, because Draco was already there. Draco's powerful magic expanded rapidly inside her head, building a flawless, impenetrable, mirrored fortress around her true thoughts. He was miraculously, simultaneously playing his own high-stakes hand, maintaining his arrogant physical facade, and projecting the shallow, vapid thoughts of a spoiled French heiress outward for Dolohov to read. The sheer, staggering magical power required to compartmentalize like that was breathtaking. Hermione sat perfectly still, a silent passenger in her own body, drowning in the sudden, overwhelming intimacy of being entirely wrapped in Draco Malfoy's protective magic. "I will raise by 50,000 galleons," Dolohov sneered, tossing a heavy velvet bag onto the center of the green baize. He leaned forward, his massive forearms resting heavily on the table, his dark eyes locked dead on Draco. "But galleons are so terribly boring, aren't they, Malfoy? I hear you are a man who appreciates highly unique collateral." The goblin dealer dealt the next card face down. The card is a 7 of spades. Draco's thought pierced her mind, crisp, cold, and highly clinical. "If you draw a face card, we bust. I need to force him to fold before the reveal. I am a man who appreciates not wasting my valuable time, Dolohov," Draco replied smoothly out loud, his pale fingers steepled elegantly in front of him. "What exactly are you proposing?" Dolohov's eyes flicked rapidly to Hermione, the ugly, predatory hunger returning tenfold. "If I win this hand, I want the French bird. For the weekend. I have a highly secure private estate in the mountains. She looks like she could use some robust, uninterrupted entertainment." The world simply stopped. The heavy, smoke-filled air of the casino vanished. The rhythmic pulse of the jazz band faded into a distant, buzzing hum. Hermione's heart slammed against her ribs with the brutal force of a bludger. The pure, unadulterated terror she had suppressed came clawing violently back up her throat, choking her. She waited for Draco to laugh it off. She waited desperately for him to insult Dolohov's filthy lineage, to draw his wand, to do absolutely anything that proved the protective warmth she felt in her mind was real. Instead, Draco leaned back in his plush chair, a slow, utterly cruel smirk spreading across his pale aristocratic features. My dear Dolohoff, he drawled, his voice dripping with bored sadistic amusement. Lyra is terribly high maintenance. But if you are willing to wager the silver vault key currently resting in your left breast pocket against her weekend companionship, I might be persuaded to let you try and entertain her. The betrayal was instantaneous and absolute. The emotional seesaw slammed violently into the dirt. A sickening, freezing wave of doubt and horror crashed over Hermione. He had sold her. He had actually verbally sold her to a known torturer and murderer for a piece of metal. The mission was paramount, yes, but to use her body as literal collateral. The vicious boy who had coldly watched her bleed on his drawing room floor was back, sitting right beside her, wearing a custom-tailored suit. Her mind screamed in raw panic, her mental walls violently trying to rebuild themselves to shut him out, to protect herself from the monster currently residing inside her head. "Stop!" Draco's mental voice roared in her mind, so incredibly loud and forceful she physically flinched in her seat. The icy grip he had on her consciousness tightened painfully, restricting her mental movement. At him through the psychic link, her at him through the psychic link, her internal voice fracturing with raw, desperate, invisible tears, even as her physical face remained perfectly, terrifyingly blank for the observing room. "I am getting the key," he snarled mentally, his psychic presence wrapping around her thrashing mind like a steel vice, forcing her to remain perfectly still, forcing her to endure the waking nightmare. Look at his hand, Hermione. Look at his cards. He's holding a 2 and a 3. He's bluffing. He thinks I am entirely distracted by his crude bait. I am not going to let him touch you. I swear it. "The vault key?" Dolohoff laughed harshly, his greedy eyes lighting up with the sick thrill of the gamble. He reached into his tailored pocket and slammed a heavy, ornate silver key onto the table. "You are arrogant, Malfoy. Very well. The key against the girl. Dealer, turn the cards." The external conflict was reaching its absolute zenith. The entire VIP section seemed to hold its collective breath. The goblin dealer reached forward with a long wooden paddle and flipped Dolohoff's cards. A 2 of diamonds, a 3 of clubs, 5 total. "Your turn, Monsieur Malfoy," the dealer rasped. Draco didn't even look at his own cards. He kept his eyes locked firmly, terrifyingly on Dolohoff. Slowly, deliberately, he flipped his first card. A king of hearts. 0 value in Bakarat. Hermione's lungs stopped working completely. If the next card was anything less than a 6, they lost. She belonged to Dolohoff. The sheer, suffocating terror of the moment was paralyzing. The mental link between her and Draco was a raging storm of chaotic, violent energy. She could suddenly feel his heart rate through the bond, perfectly steady on the outside, but hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm on the inside. He was terrified too. Draco's long, pale fingers hovered delicately over the second card. The tension at the table was a massive physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, crushing the breath right out of her lungs. "I have you, Granger." A sudden, shockingly soft whisper brushed against her mind. It wasn't the harsh, commanding voice of the Ministry mission leader. It was a terrifyingly intimate, intensely vulnerable promise that sank deep into her bones, completely overriding the crushing panic. "I will always have you." He flipped the card. A 9 of spades. A natural 9. The highest possible hand. Dolokhof's face turned a violent, mottled shade of purple. He roared in blind fury, his massive fists slamming down onto the green baize, violently rattling the crystal glasses across the VIP section. "You cheated!" he spat, thick spittle flying from his lips. "You arrogant, inbred piece of filth! You cheated me!" "I merely played the odds, Dolokhov," Draco replied, his voice a lethal, freezing whisper that cut through the noise. He stood up slowly, his imposing, threatening height suddenly very apparent to everyone at the table. He reached out and snatched the heavy silver vault key from the table, slipping it smoothly into his own pocket. "Perhaps next time, focus significantly less on my companion and more on your incredibly pathetic hand." He turned to Hermione, holding out his hand. The tense game was over. They had won the crucial key. The external conflict of the table was officially resolved. But as she placed her trembling fingers into his steady palm, the internal conflict raged harder than ever. He pulled her up, wrapping his arm tightly, highly possessively around her waist. The physical warmth of his body against hers was a deeply jarring contrast to the cold, ruthless facade he still wore for the staring casino. As they walked swiftly away from the furious smuggler, the heavy mental link between them began to slowly, painfully sever. But just before the final magical thread of their psychic connection snapped completely, Draco deliberately pushed one final, unshielded emotion directly into her mind. It wasn't smug triumph. It wasn't arrogant satisfaction over winning the key. It was a blast of pure, possessive, burning rage directed entirely at the man who had dared to speak about her like property. Hermione stumbled slightly as the link finally broke, her mind reeling violently from the heavy, suffocating weight of that dark, intensely protective fury. She looked up at his sharp profile as he practically dragged her toward the velvet-draped corridor leading directly to the underground vaults. He had gambled her life, but he had also shielded her mind with his own, and the terrifying, inescapable truth was that she had trusted him. The bright safety of the casino floor vanished behind them, quickly replaced by the damp, stone-walled silence of the restricted vault level. The real, physical danger of the heist was only just beginning, and Hermione was completely, utterly terrified by how desperately she wanted him to pull her back into the dark safety of his mind. The heavy, wrought iron door sealed shut behind them with a deafening final clang, instantly severing the opulent noise and golden light of the casino floor. They were plunged into the dimly lit, cavernous silence of the restricted vault level. The air down here was vastly different, damp, freezing and thick with the metallic, coppery scent of ancient, blood-tied wards. The external conflict of surviving the gambling floor was over, replaced immediately by the grim reality of breaking into a high-security magical vault. But the internal conflict, the chaotic, bleeding wound left by Draco's ruthless gamble upstairs, demanded immediate resolution. The very second the magical locks clicked into place on the iron door, sealing them alone in the stone corridor, Hermione tore herself violently from Draco's grip. The physical repulsion was instinctual, a violent rejection of the warmth she had so desperately craved mere moments before. She stumbled back until her spine hit the freezing, damp stone of the corridor wall, her chest heaving as she glared at him through the gloom. "You bet me," she hissed, her voice trembling violently with a volatile mixture of pure adrenaline and raw, unadulterated fury. The terrifying echo of his psychic voice, "I will always have you," was completely drowned out by the agonizing reality of what he had done in front of the entire VIP room. You actually sat there, looked that monster in the eye, and used me as a piece of meat to secure a piece of metal. Draco stood perfectly still in the center of the corridor. The flickering light from a solitary torch mounted on the wall cast harsh, skeletal shadows across the sharp, aristocratic planes of his face. He didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. The freezing, impenetrable armor of the Malfoy heir was locked firmly in place, his grey eyes utterly devoid of the chaotic, protective fire she had felt tearing through his mind. "I won the key, Granger," he stated, his voice a flat, deadened monotone that chilled her down to the marrow of her bones. He casually adjusted the cuffs of his pristine white shirt, his movements infuriatingly precise. "The mission parameters dictated that we secure access to the vault by any means necessary. I assessed the tactical situation, identified Dolohov's primary weakness, his base, predictable lust, and I exploited it flawlessly. You are unharmed. The objective is secured. Stop behaving like a hysterical child." The emotional seesaw slammed violently downward, shattering the fragile, terrifying trust she had just begun to build. The sheer, calculated cruelty of his words felt like a physical slap. He was entirely dismissing her trauma, completely reducing her profound, suffocating terror to a mere variable in his cold Slytherin equation. "A tactical situation?" Hermione choked out, her hands curling into tight, trembling fists at her sides. "I am not a bloody chess piece, Malfoy. I am your partner. You bypassed my consent entirely. You severed the mental link and left me drowning in panic while you gambled my physical safety." "I never once lost control of the table," Draco shot back, his voice finally cracking, a sharp, deadly edge bleeding through the icy facade. He took a sudden, aggressive step toward her, the space between them instantly charged with a volatile, crackling energy. I knew his hand. I knew exactly what cards were left in the shoe. The mathematical probability of him drawing a winning card was 0.04%. It was a calculated risk. "It wasn't your risk to take," she screamed, uncaring if the sound echoed down the stone corridor. She pushed away from the wall, marching directly into his space, completely abandoning her survival instincts in the face of her overwhelming rage. She shoved him hard in the center of his chest. "You do not get to make those choices for me. You do not get to play God with my life just because you think you are the smartest person in the room." She shoved him again, harder this time. Draco stumbled back half a step, his jaw clenching so tightly she could hear his teeth grinding together. But he didn't raise his wand. He didn't push her back. "You think I enjoyed it?" he suddenly snarled, the sound ripping from his throat like a physical wound. The emotional seesaw tipped violently, launching them away from the freezing repulsion and plunging them straight into a terrifying, burning approach. In a blur of motion, Draco lunged forward. He didn't strike her. Instead, his large hands clamped viciously around her upper arms, pulling her flush against his chest. He backed her up against the damp stone wall with a heavy, unyielding thud. The sheer, overwhelming heat of his body radiated through the thin silk of her dress, a suffocating, intoxicating contrast to the freezing environment of the vaults. "Do you have any earthly idea what it took for me to sit at that table and let that filthy, degenerate pig look at you like that?" Draco breathed, his face dropping so low his forehead practically rested against hers. The icy, arrogant mask completely shattered, revealing the agonizing, raw desperation burning fiercely beneath it. His silver eyes were wide, dilated, and entirely fixed on her parted lips. "Do you know how badly I wanted to draw my wand and flay him alive right there on the casino floor? To rip his eyes out for daring to touch you with them?" Hermione froze, her breath permanently caught in her throat. The conflict between her furious indignation and the sudden, overwhelming exposure of his protective possessiveness paralyzed her. She could feel the violent, erratic hammering of his heart against her own chest. He wasn't cold. He wasn't unfeeling. He was burning alive from the inside out. "I had to build a fortress inside your mind just to keep you from sensing my own panic," he confessed, his voice a harsh, fractured whisper that scraped intimately against the shell of her ear. His grip on her arms loosened slightly, his thumbs involuntarily stroking the bare, sensitive skin just below her shoulders. "If I had broken character, if I had defended you the way I desperately wanted to, we would both be dead right now, Granger. I used you as bait because it was the only way to keep you alive. And I would do it again in a heartbeat if it meant you walked out of this wretched building breathing." The absolute, devastating sincerity in his words completely dismantled her anger. The warmth, intense, terrifying, and deeply confusing, flooded back into the space between them. She was staring directly into the soul of a man who was willing to be the villain in her eyes just to ensure her survival. The urge to close the minuscule distance between them, to press her lips against the harsh, beautiful line of his jaw, was so sudden and violently strong it made her physically dizzy. Before she could process the overwhelming surge of raw affection, the sharp, rhythmic sound of heavy, booted footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor. The guards. The immediate, paralyzing spell of their intimacy broke instantly. The external conflict came rushing violently back. Draco's eyes widened. He immediately released her arms, spinning around and drawing his wand in one fluid, terrifyingly lethal motion. "Two of them," Draco hissed, his voice dropping to a barely audible register. He practically shoved Hermione into a shallow, dark alcove set into the stone wall, pressing his own body flush against hers to conceal them both in the heavy shadows. "Do not move. Do not breathe." Hermione pressed her spine as hard as she could against the cold stone, but Draco's body was a solid, inescapable wall of heat, trapping her entirely. His chest was pressed firmly against her breasts. His muscular thigh was slotted perfectly between hers. The forced physical proximity was absolute torture, completely supercharging the unresolved emotional tension simmering dangerously between them. She could feel the steady, reassuring rise and fall of his chest, the faint, maddening scent of bergamot and dark magic wrapping tightly around her senses. The heavy footsteps grew louder, the flickering light of the guards' wands briefly illuminating the damp floor just inches from their hiding spot. Draco slowly, silently raised his wand, his jaw locked in intense concentration, ready to cast a lethal, silent curse the moment they were discovered. Hermione instinctively reached out in the dark, her trembling fingers finding the lapel of his black jacket, gripping the expensive fabric like a physical lifeline. The guards paused directly in front of their alcove. Hermione shut her eyes tightly, her heart screaming in her chest, fully expecting the blinding flash of a discovery spell. But the men merely muttered a curse in Russian about the dampness, completely oblivious to the two ministry agents hiding mere inches away, and continued their patrol down the intersecting corridor. As the footsteps slowly faded into the distance, the suffocating tension finally broke. Draco slowly lowered his wand, exhaling a long, shuddering breath that ruffled the curls at her temple. He didn't immediately step back. For one agonizing, suspended moment in the dark, he remained pressed flush against her, his head bowed, his forehead resting heavily against her shoulder. It was an act of profound, silent exhaustion, a fleeting moment of pure surrender to the emotional toll of the mission. Then, exactly as he always did, he pulled away. The emotional seesaw leveled out into a tense, vibrating neutrality. "Come on," Draco murmured, his voice thick and slightly unsteady. He stepped out of the alcove, pulling the silver vault key from his pocket. "The main vault is at the end of this hall. We have less than 10 minutes before Dolohov realizes he has been played and sends the entire casino security force down here to kill us." Hermione nodded silently, stepping out of the shadows, her body feeling completely hollow and cold without his physical presence. They moved swiftly down the corridor, arriving at a massive circular door forged from solid, enchanted goblin steel. The surface was completely devoid of handles, featuring only a single glowing silver keyhole in the direct center. The conflict of reaching the vault was resolved. But as Draco slid the heavy silver key into the lock and turned it with a sickening metallic click, the heavy steel door didn't just swing open. Instead, a blinding, violent wave of dark purple magic exploded outward from the doorframe, knocking Draco forcefully backward. The heavy steel door slowly began to grind open on ancient hinges, but the path inside was entirely blocked by a swirling, impenetrable wall of dark, suffocating smoke. Draco hit the damp stone floor hard, swearing viciously as he scrambled back to his feet. He stared at the swirling purple vortex blocking their objective, his face draining of all color. "It's a localized blood traitor ward," Draco whispered, absolute horror bleeding into his tone as he recognized the ancient, deadly magic guarding the ledger. He turned to look at Hermione, the desperate, protective fire returning instantly to his eyes. "Granger, if you take one step through that doorway, the magic will rip your muggle-born blood straight from your veins." The air in the narrow stone corridor curdled, turning thick and metallic as the purple haze of the blood traitor ward pulsed like a dying heart. Hermione stared at the shimmering, lethal barrier, her reflection dancing in the necrotic light of the magic. It was a physical manifestation of everything that had ever stood between them. Centuries of prejudice, a war that had nearly broken the world, and the very blood that Draco had been taught to loathe from the moment he could speak. "Don't touch it," Draco commanded, his voice cracking with a raw, unshielded desperation. He lunged forward, grabbing her wrist and pulling her back with such force that she stumbled against his chest. "Hermione, look at it. It's an ancient Black family curse variant. It doesn't just stop you, it unravels you. If you cross that threshold, you won't make it 2 steps before your heart stops." The emotional seesaw tipped violently into a cold, paralyzing dread. The external mission was at a total standstill. The ledger, the only thing that could stop the rising tide of dark art smuggling, was sitting less than 20 feet away, yet it might as well have been on the moon. Hermione looked up at Draco, seeing the sheer terror etched into every sharp line of his face. For the first time, the approach wasn't a calculated move for the mission. It was a frantic, soul-deep need to keep her from vanishing into the smoke. "The ledger is right there, Draco," she whispered, her voice sounding small and fragile against the heavy hum of the ward. She used his name instinctively, the Malfoy persona having burned away in the heat of the vault's basement. "If we don't get it now, Dolohof's men will be here in minutes. Everything we've done, the carriage, the casino, that god-awful card game, it will all be for nothing." "I don't care about the ledger," he roared, the sound echoing off the damp stone walls like a gunshot. He gripped both of her shoulders now, his fingers digging into the silk of her dress. "I am not watching you die in a hole under a casino for a ministry file. Do you understand me? We are leaving. Now." The betrayal of the mission's priority hit her, but it was wrapped in such a staggering layer of devotion that she couldn't breathe. He was willing to fail. Draco Malfoy, the man who lived for status and success, was willing to walk away in disgrace just to ensure she kept drawing breath. The warmth of his admission was a blinding sun in the darkness of the vault, but Hermione's logical mind was already racing, dismantling the magical structure of the ward. "It's keyed to blood purity," she said, her eyes narrowing as she studied the swirling patterns of the purple smoke. "But it's a physical barrier, not a conceptual one. It reacts to the taint of non-magical lineage." "Draco, if my blood isn't the one touching the ward, I can pass." He shook his head vehemently, his blonde hair falling over his eyes. "No. No, Granger. Whatever insane arithmancy-based suicide mission you're dreaming up, the answer is no." "Listen to me," she snapped, grabbing the lapels of his robes and pulling him down to her level. The conflict between them intensified, a battle of wills fueled by mutual terror. "If you cast a full-body Protego and I layer it with a localized blood-bonding charm, if I am technically covered by your signature, the ward might read me as you, as a pureblood." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of history. A blood-bonding charm was ancient, intimate, and practically matrimonial in its magical depth. To share a signature was to temporarily merge their magical essences. It was a level of trust that went far beyond legilimency. It was an admission that, for a few minutes, they were one and the same. Draco's breath was ragged, his eyes searching hers for any sign of doubt. "It's theoretical, Hermione. If the layer thins, even for a second." "Then do not let it thin," she challenged, her voice steadying. "Trust your magic. I am trusting mine." The emotional seesaw swung back to a state of profound, terrifying trust. Draco didn't speak. He simply drew his wand, his hand trembling slightly before he steadied it with a sharp, indomitable focus. He began the incantation, a low, rhythmic chanting in Latin that made the very air vibrate. Hermione felt the magic take hold, a shimmering, translucent gold veil that began at her toes and swept upward, coating her skin in a layer of warmth that felt exactly like Draco's touch. Then came the bond. He reached out, his bare palm pressing against hers. He whispered the final words, and Hermione felt a sharp electric sting in the center of her chest. Suddenly, the world felt different. She could feel the hum of his magic as if it were her own pulse. She could taste the bergamot on the back of her tongue. She was draped in him, shielded by the very essence of the man who had once been her greatest enemy. "Now," he whispered, his eyes never leaving hers. "Do not let go of my hand. If we break physical contact, the signature fragments." Together, they turned toward the swirling purple abyss. Hermione took a breath, her heart hammering against the golden cage of Draco's magic. They stepped forward. The sensation was horrific. The ward shrieked in protest, the purple smoke roiling and snapping at them like a pack of wolves. Hermione felt a crushing pressure on her lungs, a cold, oily film trying to find a gap in the gold. But Draco's grip on her hand was a vice. He poured every ounce of his will into the shield, his face contorting with the sheer agony of holding back a curse meant to kill. "Keep moving," he wheezed, his knuckles white. They pushed through the threshold. The air snapped, the pressure vanishing as they tumbled into the silent, sterile interior of the vault. The purple ward hissed behind them, a wall of death they had somehow cheated. Hermione collapsed to her knees, gasping for air, her hand still locked in Draco's. He fell beside her, his chest heaving, sweat beading on his brow. The room was small, filled with gold coins and dark artifacts, but in the center, resting on a velvet pedestal, was the ledger. The external conflict was almost resolved. Hermione scrambled up, snatching the book and shoving it into her magically expanded evening bag. "We have it! Draco, we have it!" She turned to him, her face alight with triumph, but the expression died instantly. Draco was staring at the doorway they had just crossed. His face was a mask of cold, sudden realization. The emotional seesaw swung back to repulsion, not of her, but of himself. "We shouldn't have been able to do that," he said, his voice hollow and dead. "What do you mean? The charm worked, the signature—" "No, Hermione," he interrupted, standing up slowly and wiping the sweat from his face with a trembling hand. He looked at her with a mixture of profound sorrow and self-loathing. A blood-bonding charm only works if the two signatures are compatible. It only works if there is an existing affinity. The ward let us through because, on some fundamental magical level, the magic couldn't tell where I ended and you began. The implication hung in the air, heavier than the dark magic surrounding them. It wasn't just a clever trick of arithmancy. Their magic had merged because they were already deep down entwined. The attraction she had tried to hide, the protectiveness he had fought to suppress. It was so real that the ancient, murderous magic of his ancestors had recognized it as truth. The warmth of the discovery was immediately doused by the cold reality of their situation. Draco turned away, his shoulders rigid. "We need to go. The guards will have heard the ward's discharge." "Draco, wait. Don't," he snapped, the walls slamming back up with a violence that made her flinch. "We have the ledger. The mission is the priority. Everything else, everything that happened in that corridor, it was just a side effect of the stress. Do you understand?" The rejection was sharp, a jagged glass shard in her chest. He was retreating again, terrified by the depth of what they had just shared. The trust was gone, replaced by a defensive coldness that felt like a betrayal of the soul. "Fine," Hermione said, her voice turning as brittle as parchment. "The mission. Let's go." But as they approached the exit, a low, mocking laugh echoed from the corridor outside. The purple ward flickered and died, suppressed by a more powerful force. Standing in the doorway, flanked by a dozen guards with levelled wands, was Yuri Dolohov. He was no longer the bumbling, lustful fool from the card table. He looked lean, lethal, and utterly triumphant. "A touching scene," Dolohov sneered, stepping into the vault. The pure-blood prince and his little pet playing at heroics. "I must thank you, Malfoy. I could never quite get that ward to accept my signature. But now that you've opened the door for me..." He raised his wand, a green light beginning to glow at the tip. "I think I'll take the ledger, and then I'll take my time breaking what's left of you." The middle of their journey had ended in a trap. The external conflict had escalated to a fight for their lives, and the internal conflict, the bridge they had built only to have Draco try and burn it, left them fractured at the worst possible moment. Hermione reached for her wand, her heart breaking, even as her mind began to calculate their odds of survival, which were now rapidly approaching 0. "Step behind me, Hermione," Draco whispered. But this time, there was no ice in his voice. Only the terrifying final resolve of a man who knew he wasn't coming home. The vault, once a sanctuary of cold gold and ancient silence, became a pressurized chamber of imminent violence. Yuri Dolohov stood framed in the doorway, the green light of his wand reflecting off the silver buttons of Draco's robes. The guards behind him shifted, their heavy boots scraping against the stone, a rhythmic sound of closing jaws. "I'll give you one chance, Malfoy," Dolohov rumbled, his voice thick with a triumphant, oily satisfaction. "Drop the bag. Step away from the girl. Your father still has friends in high places. I might be persuaded to let you walk out of here with your skin intact. But the mudblood stays. She's cost me too much tonight to be granted a quick exit." Hermione felt the air leave her lungs. The repulsion of Draco's earlier withdrawal was instantly cauterized by a new, sharper fear. She looked at the back of Draco's head, at the rigid line of his shoulders. This was the ultimate test of the emotional seesaw. Trust or betrayal, survival or sacrifice. Draco didn't move. He didn't even flinch at the slur. Slowly, with a deliberate, haunting grace, he raised his wand. He didn't point it at the guards. He pointed it at the ceiling. "You've always been a remarkably dull creature, Yuri," Draco said, his voice dropping into that lethal, aristocratic purr that made Hermione's skin prickle. "You think I came down here without a contingency? You think I'd let a man who smells of cheap fire whiskey and failure dictate the terms of my evening?" "Bold words for a man staring at 12 wands," Dolohov sneered, his eyes narrowing. "Kill him. Keep the girl alive, mostly." "Hermione," Draco whispered, the use of her name a sudden, scorching approach in the middle of the ice. "On my mark. Eye of the storm." Before she could ask what he meant, Draco slashed his wand upward. "Confringo." He didn't hit the guards. He hit the massive, enchanted chandelier of floating candles and goblin-wrought iron above their heads. The explosion was deafening. Shards of crystal and heavy metal rained down, creating a chaotic curtain of fire and debris. In the same breath, Draco spun around, his left hand snaring Hermione's waist and pulling her violently toward the back of the vault. "The ventilation shaft!" he shouted over the roar of spells being traded. "Behind the tapestry!" The external conflict exploded into a frantic, high-stakes skirmish. Red and green jets of light hissed past them, shattering stone and melting gold. Hermione fired back, her stupefied charms precise and desperate, knocking back the first wave of guards who tried to lunge through the smoke. They reached the back wall. Draco ripped down a heavy, rotting tapestry depicting the Black family tree, revealing a narrow, dark opening intended for the vault's air circulation. It was a tight, suffocating squeeze, but it was their only exit. "Go! Now!" Draco commanded, shoving her toward the hole. "Not without you," she screamed, her heart fracturing at the thought of him staying behind to hold the line. The warmth of his protection was now a suffocating weight. She grabbed the sleeve of his robes, her fingers locking onto him. "Draco, if you stay, they'll kill you." "I'm right behind you, Granger. Move!" She scrambled into the shaft, the cold metal biting into her palms. She crawled frantically, the sound of exploding masonry echoing behind her. After what felt like an eternity of darkness and dust, she felt a hand grab her ankle. She let out a sob of relief. It was Draco. He tumbled out of the shaft into a secondary, lower-level maintenance room, his robes torn and his face streaked with soot and blood. The room was small, filled with clicking brass gears and the hum of the casino's magical cooling systems. They were momentarily safe, but the silence was heavy with a new, agonizing tension. Draco slumped against a large bronze gear, his breath coming in ragged, painful hitches. He clutched his side, and Hermione saw the dark, spreading stain of blood against his white shirt. "You're hit!" she gasped, dropping to her knees beside him. She reached for his shirt, her hands trembling. "Draco, let me see." "It's just a grazing hex," he wheezed, but his face was deathly pale. He batted her hands away, the repulsion returning with a bitter defensive edge. "Stay back, Hermione. I'm fine. Just get the ledger ready for the portkey." "You are not fine," she yelled, the conflict between them boiling over. "Stop pushing me away. Every time we get close, every time you show a shred of humanity, you slam the door in my face. You gambled my life, you saved my life, and now you're bleeding out on a floor, and you're still trying to play the cold, untouchable Malfoy." Draco looked at her then, and the mask didn't just slip, it disintegrated. His grey eyes were wet, burning with an intensity that made her entire body tremble. "Because I can't look at you without remembering what I am," he choked out, the words raw and jagged. "I am the boy who stood by while you were tortured. I am the man who had to pretend to sell you tonight just to keep you from a worse fate. How am I supposed to let you close, Hermione? How am I supposed to touch you when I know I don't deserve to breathe the same air as you?" The emotional seesaw stopped mid-air. The betrayal wasn't his actions tonight. It was the way he saw himself. The doubt wasn't about his loyalty, but about his worth. Hermione reached out, and this time she didn't let him pull away. She cupped his face with both hands, her thumbs brushing away the soot on his cheekbones. The approach was absolute, a total surrender to the gravity pulling them together. "You don't get to decide what you deserve," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I decide that, and I decided a long time ago that I wasn't going to let you drown in that house, Draco. Not then, and certainly not now." The silence in the maintenance room grew thick, charged with the same electric affinity that had fooled the vault's blood ward. Draco's hand came up, hovering uncertainly near her waist, before finally settling there, his fingers digging into the silk of her dress. He leaned his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling in the cramped mechanical space. "We have to go," he murmured, though he didn't move. "The port key activates in 3 minutes, at the sea wall." "I know," she breathed. "If we make it out of here." He trailed off, the uncertainty in his voice more heartbreaking than any shout. "We will," she promised. But the moment of warmth was shattered by a low, rhythmic thumping from the maintenance door. It wasn't the guards. It was something heavier, something magical. The door began to glow a dull, menacing red as the lock started to melt. "They found us," Draco said, his voice regaining its lethal edge. He stood up, despite the wound in his side, and pulled Hermione to her feet. "The sea wall is through that tunnel. Once you hit the water, swim for the buoy. It's the port key." "We swim together," she said, her wand held high. The door burst open, not with an explosion, but with a silent, terrifying disintegration. Standing there was not Dolohov, but a tall, hooded figure wearing the bone-white mask of a high-ranking syndicate assassin. The air in the room turned to ice. This wasn't a gambler or a thug. This was a professional. The assassin didn't speak. He simply flicked his wand, and a lash of purple flame whipped toward them. Draco threw up a shield, the impact throwing them both against the brass machinery. The external conflict had shifted from a heist to a desperate survival against a superior foe. Hermione fired a flurry of curses, but the assassin deflected them with a casual, bored movement of his wrist. "Go, Hermione!" Draco yelled, casting a powerful depulso at a steam pipe. The pipe burst, filling the room with blinding, scalding white vapor. In the chaos, they scrambled toward the exit tunnel, the sound of the ocean growing louder ahead of them. They burst out onto a narrow stone ledge overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. The moon was high, reflecting off the dark, churning water. 50 yards out, a small, rhythmic green light signaled the portkey boy. "Jump!" Draco shouted. They hit the water together. The cold was a physical shock, a brutal repulsion of the senses. Hermione struggled to the surface, her heavy silk dress dragging her down like a lead weight. She gasped for air, searching for Draco in the dark waves. "Over here!" he called, his voice faint against the crashing surf. They swam with everything they had, the adrenaline masking the pain and the cold. Behind them, on the sea wall, the assassin appeared, his white mask glowing in the moonlight. He raised his wand, pointing it directly at the two heads bobbing in the water. Hermione reached the buoy first, her hand slipping on the wet metal. She looked back, seeing Draco just a few feet away, his movements sluggish. The assassin's wand flared with a sickly yellow light. "Draco, take my hand!" she screamed. He lunged, his fingers catching hers just as the spell hit the water where he had been a second before, sending a massive plume of boiling foam into the air. The buoy began to glow bright blue. The familiar, violent tug behind the navel took hold. The world began to spin. The casino, the sea, the blood, and the fire all blurring into a single chaotic streak of light. But as the portkey whisked them away, the feeling of, "I need to know what's next," was no longer about the mission. It was about the fact that Draco Malfoy's hand was still locked in hers, and he hadn't let go. The outcome was decided, But the resolution was only just beginning. The world reassembled itself with a violent, bone-jarring thud. The transition from the freezing Mediterranean to the dry, dusty floor of a ministry safe house was so abrupt it felt like being turned inside out. Hermione collapsed onto the rough wooden floorboards, her lungs burning, her soaked silk gown clinging to her like a second suffocating skin. The ledger, heavy and damp in her bag, thumped against her hip, a silent testament to the hell they had just escaped. Beside her, Draco was a heap of dark robes and ragged breathing. The safe house, a derelict cottage on the outskirts of a forgotten Welsh village, was silent, save for the whistling wind rattling the boarded-up windows. The external mission was technically over. The target was secured. But as the adrenaline began to bleed out of her system, replaced by a deep, hollow ache, the internal conflict between them rose up like a physical wall. "Draco," she gasped, pushing herself up on shaking arms. He didn't answer. He was curled on his side, his face pressed against the dusty floor, his hand still clutching his wand with a white-knuckled grip. The spreading crimson stain on his white shirt had turned a sickly dark brown, diluted by the seawater. "Draco!" Hermione scrambled toward him, her knees barking against the wood. She rolled him onto his back, and her heart nearly stopped. His eyes were half closed, rolling back into his head, and his skin was the color of winter parchment. The repulsion she had felt earlier, the fear of his coldness, was replaced by a warmth so desperate it felt like a physical fire in her chest. "Don't you dare," she hissed, her voice cracking as she pulled her wand from her sodden bodice. "Do not you dare die on me now, Draco Malfoy. Not after all of that." She began to cast, her movements frantic but precise. "Vulnera sanantur," she whispered, the rhythmic, song-like incantation of the healing spell flowing from her lips. The first pass cleared the blood. The second closed the jagged edges of the flesh. The third began to knit the skin back together. As the magic took hold, she felt the same electric affinity she had felt in the vault, the strange, terrifying resonance of their combined signatures. Draco's eyes snapped open, a sharp, gasping breath rattling in his chest. He surged upward, his hand instinctively flying to her throat before his clouded mind registered who she was. He froze, his fingers brushing the damp curls at her neck, his grey eyes wide and haunted. The emotional seesaw tipped violently into a state of approach so intense it was suffocating. For a long, silent minute, neither of them moved. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of salt water falling from their clothes onto the floor. The distrust that had defined their lives for a decade was gone, burned away by the fire of the casino and the cold of the sea. "You're a nightmare, Granger," Draco rasped, his voice a broken shadow of its usual arrogant self. He let his hand fall from her neck, but he didn't pull away. He stayed close, his knees brushing hers, the heat from the healing spell still radiating between them. A relentless, overbearing, brilliant nightmare. "And you're an idiot," she countered, a sob catching in her throat, even as she tried to glare at him. "A self-sacrificing, dramatic, stubborn idiot. Why did you jump in front of that last hex? I had a shield up." "I didn't trust your shield," he lied, though his eyes told the truth. He had moved because he couldn't bear the thought of her being touched by even a flicker of pain. He sat back against a moth-eaten sofa, his head thumping against the upholstery. He looked broken, stripped of the Malfoy armor, leaving only the man beneath. The conflict of the night, the betrayal of his gamble, the warmth of his protection demanded a final reckoning. "We have the ledger," he said, staring at the ceiling. "The Ministry will have their names. Dolohov will be in Azkaban by dawn. The mission is a success." "Is that all it was?" Hermione asked, her voice small in the vast, empty room. She stood up, her wet dress heavy and cold, and began to pace the small space. "Just a mission? The card game, the vault, the blood-bonding charm. Was that all just parameters and tactics?" The coldness returned to his expression, but it was brittle now, a defensive shield that was failing. "What else could it be, Hermione? We are what we've always been, a pure-blood failure and the Golden Girl. We were playing parts. That's what agents do." "I wasn't playing," she shouted, spinning to face him. The frustration she had carried since the carriage ride boiled over. "I wasn't playing when I let you into my head, Draco. I wasn't playing when I trusted you to hold my magic in that vault. And you weren't playing when you looked at me in that maintenance room. You can lie to the Ministry, and you can lie to yourself, but don't you dare lie to me." Draco stood up, his movements slow and pained. He crossed the room toward her, his shadow looming large against the boarded windows. The repulsion was gone, replaced by a magnetic, terrifying approach. He stopped inches from her, the scent of the sea and the metallic tang of magic still clinging to him. "You want the truth?" he whispered, his voice dangerously low. He reached out, his fingers catching a stray, damp curl and tucking it behind her ear. The touch was so gentle it made her ache. "The truth is that I have spent every second of the last 5 years trying to forget the way you looked on that drawing room floor. I have spent every second of this mission terrified that if I touched you, I would never be able to let you go." He stepped closer, his body heat cutting through the chill of her wet clothes. "The truth is that when I bet you at that table, I felt like I was carving out my own heart. But I knew I wouldn't let him have you. I would have burned that entire casino to the ground before a single hair on your head was harmed." Hermione's breath hitched. The trust was absolute now, a solid foundation beneath her feet. The internal conflict was shifting, the walls of the past crumbling under the weight of his confession. "Then why do you keep pushing me away?" she whispered, her hand rising to rest over his heart. It was beating fast, a frantic, rhythmic demand for life. "Because I'm a coward, Hermione," he admitted, his forehead dropping to rest against hers. "Because if I admit how much I want you, if I admit that you are the only thing that makes me feel like I'm not a monster, then I have everything to lose, and I've already lost so much." The emotional build-up was reaching its zenith. The slow burn of their years of animosity, the intense pressure of the night, and the warmth of their shared magic had converged into this single, quiet moment in a dusty cottage. The world outside didn't matter. The Ministry didn't matter. "You haven't lost me," she said, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. Draco let out a long, shuddering breath. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, searching for any hint of the repulsion he expected to see. He found only a reflection of his own desperate longing. "I shouldn't," he muttered, more to himself than her. "This is a mistake. A catastrophic, career-ending, life-altering mistake. Then make it, she challenged, her voice a soft, daring invitation. He didn't hesitate. Draco leaned down, his hands sliding around the back of her neck to tilt her head up. His touch was firm, possessive, and entirely real. The betrayal of their history was forgotten as his lips finally, tentatively brushed against hers. It was a soft, questioning contact, a search for permission. Hermione answered by standing on her tiptoes, her hands sliding up to pull him closer, her fingers tangling in the damp silver-blonde hair at the nape of his neck. The kiss deepened, turning from a question into a desperate, starving answer. It was a collision of everything they had suppressed: the anger, the fear, the guilt, and the undeniable burning attraction that had been simmering beneath the surface since they first met. It tasted of salt and copper, and the faint, lingering sweetness of bergamot. It was the final shift they had both been terrified of, the moment the seesaw finally levelled out. Draco groaned low in his throat, his arms wrapping around her waist and lifting her slightly off the floor, crushing her against him as if he could merge their bodies the way they had merged their magic. Hermione clung to him, her heart soaring, the coldness of the room completely forgotten in the heat of his embrace. But as they broke apart for air, foreheads still pressed together, a sharp metallic clink echoed from the corner of the room. The ledger. It was glowing. A faint, ominous purple light was pulsing from the bag Hermione had dropped. The external mission wasn't as over as they thought. The final shift was interrupted by a new, chilling realization. "Draco," Hermione whispered, her eyes fixed on the bag. "The ledger. It's not just a list of names." Draco followed her gaze, his jaw tightening as he reached for his wand. The purple light was the same hue as the blood ward in the vault. "It's a beacon," he realized, his voice turning cold once more. "Dolohov didn't just let us take it. He used us to bypass the vault's security, and now he's using the book to track us." The feeling of, "I need to know what's next," returned with a vengeance. They had found each other, but the world was still coming for them. The final resolution was still out of reach, hidden behind one last deadly obstacle. "We have to move," Draco said, but this time he didn't pull away. He grabbed her hand, interlacing their fingers, a silent promise that whatever came through that door, they would face it together. The ending was coming, and it wouldn't be a quiet one. The pulsating purple light emanating from Hermione's beaded bag cast long, rhythmic shadows against the peeling wallpaper of the safe house, looking like the heartbeat of a dying star. The cottage, which had momentarily felt like a sanctuary of shared truths and salt-stained confessions, was suddenly transformed back into a kill box. The external conflict had followed them across the sea, tethered to the very prize they had bled to obtain. He didn't just want the ledger kept safe, Draco hissed, his voice dropping into a lethal, focused register as he snatched his wand from the floor. He wanted it delivered. He knew the Ministry would send someone capable enough to crack the vault, and he let us do the heavy lifting. We've been acting as his blood-keyed couriers. Hermione's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The transition from the breathtaking warmth of their kiss to the sudden, icy repulsion of this new threat was dizzying. She felt a surge of doubt, not in Draco, but in her own brilliance. How had she missed a tracking charm of this magnitude? "It's not just a tracker, Draco," she whispered, her eyes wide as she knelt by the bag, her wand performing a rapid series of diagnostic sweeps. The magical signatures were chaotic, a jagged mess of dark energy. "It's a localized portkey anchor. He's not coming to find us. He's bringing the fight directly to this coordinate." The air in the room shifted, the pressure dropping so sharply their ears popped. The floorboards began to groan under the weight of an immense, gathering magical force. The emotional seesaw tipped violently into a state of absolute, unified trust. There was no time for the old masks, no room for the biting sarcasm that usually shielded their vulnerabilities. "How long?" Draco asked, stepping over to her and hauling her to her feet. His hand didn't go to her waist this time. It went to her shoulder, a grounding, solid weight. "Seconds," she gasped. "We can't disapparate. The anchor is jamming the local space. We have to break the ward on the book, or we're trapped here with whoever he's bringing." "Then we break it," Draco said, his grey eyes burning with a fierce, protective light. "Together, just like the vault." He didn't wait for her to suggest the arithmancy. He simply held out his hand, palm up, a silent invitation to merge their essences once more. Hermione didn't hesitate. She slammed her hand into his, their fingers interlacing with a bruising force. The approach was total. They weren't just two agents anymore. They were a single, defiant circuit of magic. "Fidelius Nexum!" they cried out in unison. The room exploded in a blinding flash of gold and silver. Hermione felt the familiar, staggering rush of Draco's magic flooding into her. The scent of rain-drenched bergamot, the sharp edge of his determination, and beneath it all, a staggering, unyielding love that he finally wasn't trying to hide. They poured their combined will into the bag, a tidal wave of pure, intent-based magic crashing against the purple rot of the Syndicate's curse. For a heartbeat, the purple light flared violently, fighting back with the screeching sound of tearing metal. Then, with a final, pathetic hiss, it extinguished. The heavy, pressurized atmosphere in the room vanished. The ledger fell silent, its dark power neutralized by the sheer force of their shared affinity. But the silence that followed was short-lived. A heavy, rhythmic thumping began at the front door. Not magic, physical force. "They were already close," Draco muttered, spinning her around to face the back exit. The anchor got them to the village. The rest, they're doing the old-fashioned way. The external conflict was reaching its final bloody resolution. They burst through the back door into the damp Welsh night, the smell of gorse and wet earth filling their lungs. Behind them, the front door of the cottage splintered inward. Shouts in Russian and the flash of curses lit up the interior of the house they had just vacated. "The cliffside!" Draco shouted, pulling her through the tall, tangled grass. "If we get far enough from the cottage, the jamming will fade." They ran, their breath hitching in their chests, the adrenaline providing a final desperate fuel. The silhouettes of Dolohov's men appeared on the ridge behind them, jets of red and green light slicing through the darkness, narrowly missing their heels. They reached the edge of the limestone cliffs, the dark Atlantic churning hundreds of feet below. It was a dead end, or a beginning. "Now!" Hermione yelled. They didn't wait to see if the pursuers had reached the ledge. They didn't wait for a final stand. They turned to each other, their eyes meeting in the moonlight for one final silent confirmation of the truth they had found in the dark. Draco's hand cupped the back of her head, his thumb brushing her cheekbone in a fleeting, agonizingly sweet warmth. "On 3, he whispered. 1, 2, 3. They didn't jump. They disapparated. The world twisted, compressed, and then shattered into 1,000 points of light before reassembling in the quiet, sterile safety of the ministry's main atrium. The transition was smooth this time, a testament to their synchronized intent. They landed on the polished stone floor, gasping, tangled in each other's arms. The silence of the ministry at 3 a.m. was absolute, broken only by the distant chime of a magical clock. The external conflict was officially over. The ledger was safe, the tracking was dead, and the mission was a triumph that would be talked about in the Aura office for decades. But as they sat there on the cold floor, soaked to the bone and shivering, the internal conflict demanded its final permanent resolution. The seesaw had stopped moving. There was no more repulsion, no more doubt. Draco pulled back slightly, his hands resting on her shoulders. He looked at her, really looked at her, without the sneer, without the guilt, and without the fear. He looked like a man who had finally stepped out of the shadows and into the light. "You're bleeding again," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion that made Hermione's throat ache. He reached out, his thumb gently wiping a smear of blood from a small cut on her forehead. "It doesn't matter," she whispered. She reached up, covering his hand with hers, pressing his palm firmly against her face. "Draco, look at me." He met her eyes, and for the first time in 10 years, there was no history between them. There was only the present. "The mission is over," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Lyra Vance is gone. The wealthy, pure-blood heir is gone. It's just us." Draco let out a long, ragged breath that sounded like a surrender. "I don't know how to be just us, Hermione. I've spent my whole life being someone's son, someone's soldier, or someone's mistake." "Then let me show you," she said. She didn't wait for him to find the words. She leaned forward, closing the distance that had felt like an ocean only hours before. This kiss was different from the one in the cottage. That had been a desperate, starving thing, born of trauma and adrenaline. This was slow, deliberate, and profoundly warm. It was a promise. It was the final shift realized in the quiet, hallowed halls of the world they had both fought to save. Draco's hands moved to her waist, pulling her flush against him, his touch no longer a tactical approach, but a deep, spiritual anchoring. He kissed her back with a tenderness that broke her heart and healed it all at once. It was the resolution to every biting remark, every cold shoulder, and every moment of shared terror they had endured. When they finally broke apart, the light of the rising sun was beginning to filter through the high windows of the atrium, casting long, golden streaks across the floor. The world was waking up, but for the first time, Hermione wasn't afraid of what the morning would bring. Draco stood up, offering his hand to her. It wasn't the arrogant gesture of a high roller at a Bakarat table. It was the simple, honest offering of a partner. "Come on, Granger," he said, a ghost of a genuine smile playing at the corners of his mouth, the first one she had ever truly seen. "Let's go turn in this bloody book. I think I've had enough of magical casinos to last me a lifetime." Hermione took his hand, her fingers locking firmly into his. The outcome was a success. The conflict was resolved, and as they walked toward the elevators together, the only thing she knew for certain was that the story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. The mission at the magical casino was over, but as they stepped into the lift, Draco leaned down, pressing one last lingering kiss to the crown of her head. "I meant what I said in the vault, you know," he whispered as the doors slid shut. "I will always have you." "I know," she smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "And I have you." The elevator rose, leaving the darkness of the night behind, heading toward a future they had earned together. One secret, one kiss, and one impossible mission at a time. The silence of Hermione's small London flat was a living thing, a soft velvet weight that pressed against the windows, dampening the frantic hum of the city outside. For weeks, the only sounds Hermione had known were the rhythmic crashing of the Mediterranean, the hiss of terminal curses, and the ragged, desperate breathing of a man she had spent a decade trying to hate. Now, the loudest sound was the soft, domestic tick of a grandfather clock and the clink of a porcelain mug against a wooden coaster. The transition from the high-stakes adrenaline of Monaco to the mundane reality of recovery was a jarring psychological repulsion. The ministry had placed them both on mandatory administrative leave, citing the unprecedented magical entanglement of their blood bond. They were tethered, not by a curse, but by the lingering resonance of their combined magic. If Draco moved too far from her, Hermione felt a cold, hollow ache in her chest. If she grew distressed, Draco arrived at her door within minutes, his grey eyes blown wide with phantom panic. "You're oversteeping it," a low voice drawled from the doorway of the kitchen. Hermione blinked, coming out of her trance. She looked down at the mug in her hand, where a bag of Earl Grey had been soaking for nearly 10 minutes. She sighed, setting it aside, and turned to look at Draco. He was leaning against the door frame, dressed in a pair of muggled trousers and a soft charcoal sweater she had bought for him. Gone were the sharp, intimidating lines of his dress robes. Gone was the aristocratic armour. He looked younger, softer, and terrifyingly vulnerable. "I was thinking about the trial," she admitted, her voice small. "The Wizengamot is calling us in next week. They want a full demonstration of the bond to prove we didn't use illegal legilimency to coerce the cards." Draco walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. The approach was different now. It wasn't the predatory glide of a spy, but the cautious advance of a man learning to navigate a new world. He stopped just in front of her, the scent of bergamot and fresh parchment, his natural scent, untainted by the ozone of combat, wrapping around her. "Let them ask," Draco said, his voice dropping into that velvet register that made her knees weak. He reached out, his fingers grazing the back of her hand before interlacing with hers. The spark was still there, a warm, golden hum that vibrated through her bones. "Our magic doesn't lie, Hermione. That's why I was so afraid of it in the first place. The internal conflict of the last few weeks had been a battle against the doubt of the domestic. They were both warriors who didn't know how to be civilians. They spent their days in a state of hypervigilance, flinching at the sound of the toaster or the sudden arrival of an owl. But in the quiet moments, like this one, the warmth took over. "Do you regret it?" she asked, looking up at him. "The bond? Being tied to a nightmare like me?" Draco let out a short, huffed laugh. He reached out with his free hand, cupping her jaw and tilting her face up, His thumb traced the faint, fading scar on her forehead where the glass had cut her in the maintenance room. "I regret every year I spent pretending I didn't want this," he whispered. "I regret that it took a suicide mission and a blood ward for me to realize that I'd rather be tied to you in a ministry cell than free in a world without you." The emotional seesaw leveled out into a profound, peaceful trust. Hermione leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. The mission was a memory, the danger was a shadow, and the man holding her was the only reality that mattered. He leaned down, his lips brushing against hers in a soft, questioning contact that tasted of tea and the promise of a long, quiet afternoon. It was a kiss of recovery, a slow, healing balm for the jagged edges of their souls. The ministry atrium was a sea of flashing cameras and shouting reporters. The trial of the Mediterranean syndicate had become the spectacle of the year, and at the center of the storm stood Draco Malfoy and Hermione Granger. The external conflict was no longer about survival, but about reputation. The public was fascinated and horrified by the partnership. The war heroine and the Death Eater, bound by blood and magic. As they walked toward courtroom 10, a group of pure-blood traditionalists, men who had once dined at Malfoy Manor, blocked their path. Their leader, a sneering wizard named Selwyn, spat at the floor near Draco's boots. "Look at you, Malfoy," Selwyn hissed, his eyes darting to their joined hands. "Trailing after a mudblood like a common cur. Your father would have preferred you died in that vault." Hermione felt the repulsion of the old world's rot, the cold, familiar bite of prejudice. She felt Draco's hand tremble in hers, his fingers beginning to slip as the old shame clawed at his throat. He started to pull away, to put the distance back between them, to protect her from the filth of his association. But Hermione didn't let go. She tightened her grip, her knuckles turning white, and stepped forward, positioning herself slightly in front of him. She raised her chin, her eyes flashing with the same fire that had brought down the vault chandelier. "Lucius Malfoy is currently in a cell because he valued blood over character," Hermione said, her voice ringing out through the atrium, silencing the reporters. "Draco is standing here because he chose the opposite. If you have a problem with his company, Selwyn, you have a problem with the Ministry's Chief of Magical Law Enforcement. Move aside." The approach was a display of absolute public devotion. Draco stared at the back of her head, his expression shifting from shame to a dawning, radiant wonder. The conflict was resolved not by a wand, but by a choice. Selwyn recoiled, muttering a curse as the crowd parted like the Red Sea. Once they were inside the safety of the lifts, the doors sliding shut to muffle the roar of the crowd, Draco slumped against the wall. He pulled Hermione to him, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He was shaking, not with fear, but with the sheer weight of being defended. "You didn't have to do that," he choked out. "Yes, I did," she replied, her arms wrapping around his waist, holding him steady. "Because you're not just a Malfoy, and you're not just a partner. You're mine." Draco pulled back, his silver eyes burning with an intensity that made the small space feel electrified. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He crashed his lips against hers, a fierce, possessive kiss that claimed her as much as she had claimed him. It was a kiss of defiance, a middle finger to the world that wanted them apart, and a seal on the life they were building together. The balcony of the small villa in Menton overlooked a sea that was no longer a graveyard, but a vast, shimmering expanse of sapphire. The air was warm, smelling of lemons, lavender, and the salt of a gentle tide. It had been exactly 1 year since the mission at Lamasque door, and the final shift was finally here. Hermione sat at a small iron table, a book in her lap, watching Draco as he leaned against the stone railing. He was watching the sunset, the orange light catching the pale gold of his hair. They had spent the day swimming, laughing, and talking about things that had nothing to do with the ministry. The internal conflict had finally been laid to rest. They were no longer two agents waiting for the other shoe to drop. They were simply two people in love. "Hermione," Draco said, his voice soft, barely carrying over the sound of the cicadas. She looked up, heart skipping a beat at the look on his face. He wasn't wearing a mask. He wasn't guarded. He looked happy. He reached into the pocket of his linen shirt and pulled out a small velvet box. The approach was the final piece of the puzzle. He didn't kneel. He didn't need to perform for her. He walked over and sat on the edge of her chair, taking her hand in his. He opened the box to reveal a ring made of white gold, set with a single brilliant diamond that pulsed with a faint, familiar glow. "I had the goblins at Gringotts work on this," Draco whispered, his fingers trembling slightly. "It's charmed with the same resonance as our bond. It's not a Malfoy ring. It's a new one, for a new family." The emotional seesaw stopped forever. The outcome was a life of their own choosing. "I don't need a mission to be your partner, Hermione," he said, his eyes searching hers. "I don't need a vault to prove I'll protect you. I just want to wake up next to you every morning until the magic in these rings finally fades out. Will you stay with me?" Hermione didn't answer with words. She threw her arms around his neck, pulling him down into her lap, her tears of joy wet against his cheek. She kissed him, a deep, lingering, breathless kiss that tasted of the future. "Yes," she finally whispered against his lips. "Always." He kissed her again, more deeply this time, his hands cupping her face as the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing them in a golden hour that would never truly end. They had survived the fire, the water, and the hate, and in the end, they had found the only thing that could ever truly break a blood ward, a love that was entirely, undeniably their own.
Hello everyone, thank you for staying with this story until the end. Writing about Hermione and Draco is always a journey. For me, this story was not just about magic or spies, it was about two people who are born to be enemies. They had every reason to hate each other, the world told them to stay apart. Their story was full of pain and shadows, but in the dark they found a different truth. They learned that you can choose who you are, you can choose to forgive, and you can choose to love even when it was dangerous. I think we all have walls like Hermione, and we all have masks like Draco, but real magic happens when we let those walls fall down. I hope this story gave you a little bit of warmth. I hope it reminded you that no one is lost forever. We can all find our way to a quiet balcony by the sea. Thank you for listening. Be kind to each other and never stop looking for the light.